If you've already worked through the earlier videos that I've linked to in this YouTube video, then you have these files already set up that create this date and time on a simple web page. So what we have is just an index.html and a script.js file, and those are the only two files that we care about in this project right now. And if you don't have that, then I'd recommend going back and doing those exercises. Otherwise, you can easily catch up by just forking this repository that I'll also link to in the video description. Just click on fork here. That will copy the repository to your own account, and then you can download the files and work from the exact same thing that I've got on my screen right here. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to walk through how to use a JavaScript library. And the reason we would use a library is to make our code cleaner, to make a process easier, to basically reuse some work that somebody else has already done, or we've maybe done ourselves. And the way that you find a library is you just think of a problem that you want to work through and you Google that. So there's a couple of things to keep in mind when you're searching for libraries, and I've got this little list right here to keep in mind. So we're going to look for a JavaScript library for time. Let's see what we get here. All right, so our first hit is Moment.js, which is actually a library that I really like to use. So we're going to go ahead and check this out. And this is a process that you'd want to go through with any library that you're looking to use in your project. And the reason you would do this is because you don't want to regret your decision later on. So the first thing I check when I look at a new library is if there is active work on it. When was the latest commit? So if we go back to Moment's website here, they have GitHub linked right here, which pretty much every library you're going to use, at least any open source library, is going to have a link to their GitHub page. And then if we look at their GitHub page, there's this spot right up here. Let me go ahead and just make this page a little bit bigger so we can see it better. This right here shows us when the latest commit was. And 23 days is not too long ago. I've seen some that are 4 years old or even older, and then that tells me that I really want to avoid those because they're outdated. They probably have not, well, obviously they have not dealt with any recent bugs in browsers. They don't have recent updates. So it just does not have the features and performance that I probably want because it's so old. So I always look at how old the latest commit is, and also kind of check out how frequently is it committed. So you can see there's a lot of stuff here that shows us that it seems pretty active. So that's very reassuring. Another thing we look at is whether or not it has passing tests. So the first place you can look for that is on the GitHub account, on the GitHub repository. You check out the badges on the README. And if it doesn't have any badges, then it may not actually have any tests, because generally people want to show off that they put the work in if they want somebody to use their library. So if it doesn't have badges for tests, you probably want to avoid it. Some of these badges are just informational, so this gives us the version of NPM that it's using. These are just some links, how many downloads it's had. But the two that I really care about here is this build, and that it's passing, and the test coverage, and that's 96%. Both of these are colored green, which generally indicates that it's within a reasonable threshold for tests. So that's very reassuring to me. Now, Moment.js also has a page dedicated to showing you the tests that they have set up. Now there is a lot of tests, so this is actually going to take a while for my browser to load. You can see here how many tests have passed, and then you can even walk through all of the different tests that they've set up. So that's very reassuring to me that they've done their homework and it is well tested and it is going to be resilient, and I can have confidence in this library. So those are things that I look for initially. In addition to that, I look for documentation. This one's another really important one for me. Usually, if it has a web page, it's going to have docs and guides. And if it doesn't have this, you may struggle to use the library, because if a library's been built, you need to know how to use it, how to implement it in your page, how to install it. And good docs are going to walk you through all those steps and provide you with examples that you can even copy and paste into your code. So I definitely look for docs. That also reassures me that there's a community around it that is working on this library because it's so well documented. Another thing that's kind of, at least in this example, showing me that there's a community around it, which is the fourth thing that I would check for, is that there are so many different ways that I can use it, not only in the browser, which is what we'll do today, but also Node and Bower, and just a lot of different ways you can use this in your application. And the fact that there are so many represented here tells me that there's a lot of people that are working and contributing to this open source library. So that makes me really happy. So those are the main things that any library I'm going to look at, I look at these things, and that helps me feel good about the decision that I'm making so that 6 months down the road when I need to add a new feature, I don't regret that I have a library that's outdated and not receiving updates because I need the newest feature that's been released for browsers or something like that. So that's why I check for these things, to make sure that it's constantly receiving updates so that I know and have confidence that when I need it, it's going to be ready for me. So, okay, now that we know how to look for a library, let's go ahead and jump in and use this thing. So let me reset my screen a little bit here so we can see everything. We're going to use, like I mentioned earlier, the browser method to use this library. And in more complicated projects, you'd probably use something like Node. And that's a good thing that we'll actually review that in a different video. But we're going to use the browser for now, just for simplicity, because it takes very little setup. So what we're going to do is, in your files, you should have an index.html. I'm going to go ahead and switch to that now. And it should look something like this. And it has our header tags, our header elements that have our default time and our default date. And then down here, you can see we're loading our script.js file, which if you look at the tab right here, you can see that's what my JS file is named. What we're going to do is load Moment.js into this file. And there's a couple ways you can do it. You can download the file so that you have it saved within your repository. We're actually going to just use a hosted version so that we don't need to download it. And the thing to keep in mind when you're adding it to your page is that your browser is going to read this HTML file from the top to the bottom. And so you want to place things in an appropriate order so that the page has it when it needs it. So if we're going to reference something from Moment.js in scripts.js, we need to load moments before that. So keep that in mind. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to put it right here. All right, so I'm just adding a little comment there just for the sake of knowing exactly what we're going to put there. And now we're going to go ahead and read the documentation on Moment.js. And because I already know that I'm going to use the browser, it gives me an example of what it might look like. So this first line here is how they've imported it. And this little chunk here is them using it in the page. Okay, so what we want to do is import it. Now there is no path right here. This is just assuming that you have it saved locally. So if I downloaded a copy and saved it into my repository, I could do this, but we're going to use a hosted version, and we would need to download it anyways if we wanted to even do it locally. So we're going to go ahead and open this in a new tab. And we're going to let that load a minute. Now it has a lot of different versions, and I can kind of guess that these are different, well, based on the naming, these are different locales for different parts of the world. But I looked at this earlier and saw that at the very, very bottom, we have a minified version. And the difference between these two here is this Moment.js is not minified. That is, it's going to look more like a really big version of this. It's going to be very complicated, but it's going to be readable. And when something is minified, what that does is it basically takes out any spacing and any extra characters that you don't need, and it may even shorten your variable names for you. And what that does is it helps improve performance a little bit, because the user in the browser, they're never going to read your JavaScript file. So when you load something for production, you often minify the file to improve your performance so that it can load faster because there's no spaces and things like that in it. So we're going to actually use this version here, the minified version, and I can just copy URL right here. Or there's even, it looks like, copy the script tag. So let's try that and just see what that looks like. I'm going to paste. Okay, perfect. So what that did is it pasted in a script tag for me, and it looks just like this one here, only my source is now on the internet. I'm using a cloud version, something that's hosted somewhere else, but it gives me access to Moment.js, the minified version, which does not impact how we use it. It only impacts performance in a positive way. So now I'm going to go ahead and save that. And if we look at our page here, it doesn't do anything. We see nothing different other than the fact that we now have this file available to us if we were to use it. So this is still all old code. Just the fact that we added the script tag here does nothing for us. We are not actually using it yet. And if you remember back in the docs here, they had additional code right here to implement it. Now, since we have our scripts.js file, what their example shows is that you could just call this right here. You can write scripts, JavaScript, right in your browser. So let's do console.log just so that we can see it. And I'm going to save that just to show you how we can use it in the browser. All right, so I'm going to reload my page again. And now we can see in the console that there is the moment being called. So that's just showing you that you can do it in the page. But because we have scripts.js, we're going to keep our index file nice and clean, and we're going to use that file instead for all of our JavaScript. So at this point, we are now done with our index.html. We don't need to worry about this anymore. Everything else we're going to do is in scripts.js. So let's go ahead and go back to this documentation, and let's see how we can use it. So I'm a little familiar with the documentation because I've used it before. If this is something that you're going to use for a project, definitely dig in a little bit because there's some really cool features in here. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to set up a new variable that uses moment. And what we'll end up doing is you'll see that we're going to strip out a lot of this code because Moment does a lot of this, really all of this formatting for us. So there's no reason that we would need to do it the way we did it in the earlier exercises. So let's go ahead and just start at the top of the file here, and we're going to replace just one little chunk at a time. I'm going to comment this out, and what that code there did is that's what set this date. So when I reload my page, which I can do by clicking that, I went back to my default text here. Okay, so this is no longer doing anything. And what we're going to do here is we're going to do the same thing that this did, only using moment.js. So first of all, we're going to make a new constant, and we're going to call this one time at load, because we know that this variable is going to be set whenever the page loads or refreshes. And we just call moment, just like that. All right, that's all we do. Now we have a variable that has the current time when we load the page. So if we log that out, and you don't have to type this at all, I just wanted to show you. So now we're going to see this when I reload this page again. All right, this is the time at the load, and we've got our moment here. Now this looks kind of crazy. This is actually a moment object, and the example that they provided us earlier also added format. And what that does is makes it a readable string. So it's still not a real user-friendly string, but it is a readable string. So keep that in mind. We'll be using that in a moment. But right now, all I care about is having the current time when we load the page, because that also stores the current date. As you can see in here, it's November 3, 2017. All right, so now that we have our variable, let's set the date string using formatting provided by Moment.js. All right, the way to do that is let's go ahead and look at the documentation here some more. All right, we're going to jump to the display section because now we just want to display the time. We've gotten our time at the page load. Now we want to display it. And the thing I love about the documentation here is they give examples here. And if my page was bigger, you'd see how that's going to format out. But let's go ahead and do it together here. So let's make a new date string. And we're going to use our variable, our constant that we just made, time at load. And just like they show here, which our moment is represented by time at load, we're going to use format. And then if you feed it a string with specific formatting, and they have a table here that shows you exactly what your output's going to look like, depending on what you include in your string, then we can format this exactly how we want. Okay, so let's go ahead and make a string. I'm going to do lowercase d, comma, y. Now, if we look at this table here, let's go ahead and find those values. So 4 lowercase d's is going to give us the day of the week, the full word. If you wanted it shortened to 3 letters, you could do 3 little d's, or 2 letters, 2 little d's, or you can even do day of the week with numbers. For the all uppercase, we have the full month name. If we wanted to have a shorter month name, we could do just 3 M's, or we could even represent it with numbers, and you can see those different options there. Capital D, lowercase o, that's going to be the actual number, the day of the month. And then for uppercase Y's, I bet you can guess, is going to be a 4-digit year. If we wanted to do just a 2-digit year, you would just do 2 Y's. So we now have a string that's going to be formatted like this. Now we need to get it on the page. And if you remember from last time, we did this down here. I'm actually going to just copy and paste that. So we have our document, which is our HTML document here. We're getting an element by ID, and if you remember, our index page has our ID current date right here. Okay, and then once you have that, we're going to change the text content to our date string, which we've set here. So now that we've set our date string to this element using that ID, let's go ahead and I saved that file, and let's reload the page. And now I have a nicely formatted string. And you can see all of this code that I commented out is no longer necessary. We replaced all of that with these 3 lines, which in all honesty, we could even do just 2 lines by doing this. And that's the exact same thing. I like to use the constant just for clarity in what I'm using and what I'm doing. So that's why I do that. But it is not necessary. I could do it all in 1 line and then set it. Or I could, if I really wanted to be brief, I could do that. But then my line gets to be a little bit long, and so that's not exactly what I want to do. So let's just leave it like this. So there you go. That is exactly how we set our date using Moment. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing with the time. You can see here that we have a lot of code going on inside of our start time function. And if you remember, the way we did this is we created a function that then had a timeout after it did all of this processing and set the element with a current time string. It would do a timeout for half a second, and then it would do a callback to itself. So it would run again. So every half second it would run the same function. And then we had to call it once the first time right here. Now that we remember how that works, let's go ahead and comment out pretty much all of it here. We'll leave that timeout there because we'll want that in the end. But let's go ahead and do something very similar to what we did before. Now remember, we don't want to use this time at load because we want it to be constantly updating. We want to initialize our own moment inside of the function here so that it resets every time this function is called. So let's do a constant called now, and we'll call moment to create that moment. And just like we did before with our date string, we're going to create a time string, and we're going to apply some formatting to now. And just like we did before using the table that Moment.js provided us, we're going to use the hours and minutes and seconds to be able to set that time. So I'm going to use HH, MM, SS, and then A, and those are all lowercase letters. Okay, and then I'm going to do exactly what I did before to set that to the div that has the ID current time, and I'm setting the text content with my time string that I've just formatted right here. So let's save that, refresh the page. Didn't even see a change. So let's actually comment that out so we can see the change here. All right, there's back to our default. Let's uncomment it, reload. There you go. We are using Moment and can now get rid of all of this code right here. Replaced it with 3 lines. So there you go. That's how we use a library, and you can see very quickly why we use libraries. It can really shorten up the code in the file that we're actually working in, and it makes our lives a lot easier. So check it out. Check out other libraries for things you want to do. I definitely love Moment.js. It's a great one and really well documented, and super easy to use.